Original Sinners, A New Interpretation of Genesis, by John R. Coates. Narrated by Runnette. Copyright 2009 by John R. Coates. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Free Press, a division of Simon & Schuster, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2009 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. Read the Bible in your own way, and take the message because it says something special to each reader, based on his or her own experience. Joseph Campbell. When I was a boy, a measure of goodness was the number of gold stars beside one's name on the chart in the Sunday school room in our church in Pasadena, Texas. These stars earned by a successful recitation of the books of the Bible and regular recitations of select verses. Sunday school, training union, think Sunday night school, and Royal Ambassadors, a service evangelism club for schoolboys, as many as 3 church services a week, 2 weeks of vacation Bible school at the beginning of every summer, plus a week of summer church camp with its Bible study and 3 services per day, and 1 or more week-long revivals a year, a few under large clay-red tents. To grow up in the Southern Baptist Church of the 50s was to stand beneath a waterfall of words from and about Scripture. Central to Baptist doctrine was the insistence that the Bible was true as it was written, and I accepted this, even as I began to notice what appeared to be discrepancies. So it was more from curiosity than rebelliousness that I began to ask questions. It seems I asked too many of them, and of the wrong sort, as I was expelled and sent home with a note that read, "Johnny can come back to Sunday school when he stops asking so many questions." With orders from my mother to keep my mouth shut, I was allowed back the following Sunday. But I never quite returned. As the years passed, I continued to separate from the idea of the Bible's literal truth until, finally, I put it away. Now what? If the stories are not to be taken as literal, as the record of the divine presence in human affairs and of the reasonableness of faith, of what use are they? Certainly they're valuable as literature, and I did consider them as that, but I couldn't get past the quirk of having regarded Abraham, Isaac, Jacob et al. As historical figures, people who'd lived as surely as I live. While I could accept that they were not that, I could not consider them as entirely fictional. Then, in time, I was presented with an entirely new way of regarding the Bible, its characters, and their stories. No, I don't believe there was a Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve, a Cain and Abel, but I do believe in the metaphor. I live inside it, and so do you. The story of Adam and Eve rings with perfect pitch because my own life has been a constant cycle of falling from grace, Eden, regaining it, falling, regaining. I've been my brothers' and sisters' keeper, yes, but from my own smallness of spirit, my refusal to forgive, all of it justified by old hurts, like Cain, I've also been their killer, and ironically my own. In Jacob's penchant for sneaky manipulation, I see myself with greater clarity. And in the cluelessness of Joseph's youthful naivete and arrogance, I've come to understand the hatred that came my way in the summer of 1967, when, having been disliked from the first day by fellow workers in a shingle manufacturing plant, and for reasons I can only guess at, college boy was more of an epithet than a nickname, I showed up for work one day in my own coat of many colors, a canary yellow '65 Mustang convertible, my father's gift on my 21st birthday. For more than 40 years, I've witnessed the same dynamics at play in all sorts of people from all walks of life and from all over the world. Jealousy, greed, stupidity, brilliance, cowardice, bravery, hate, love. So much of the ordinary business of just being alive remains the same, even from one millennium to the next, which is why the Bible works as metaphor. And as metaphor, it loses all purchase as a measure of one's goodness or badness, loses its tyranny. Instead, it shows itself to be a mirror in which to see one's own humanity, one's flaws of character, one's strengths through the lives of the people found in its stories. There is pathos here. Adam and Eve being tossed from the Garden of Eden, the death of a son, the banishment of another, the flood, the sacrifice of Isaac, Esau's grief and anger. And humor, too. Far more than you might imagine. As I hope to show you, the narrative is run through by a river of irony that might bring an amused grin and headshake in one moment, a chuckle in another, and even a time or two of laughing out loud. And therein lies the unbreakable bond we have with the Bible and its stories. Whether or not we can ever establish the historical existence of the characters, the people, in the stories of Genesis, we have to admit that we can find the same pathos in their lives, the same humor and irony that we find in our own. While researching his book Abraham, author Bruce Feiler spoke with a 93-year-old scholar-archaeologist in the old city of Jerusalem, who told him, "All we know of Abraham is in the Bible. In the ground there is nothing. If you're looking for history, you'll be disappointed. If you're looking for Abraham, you won't be. Nor will you be disappointed if you are looking for Sarah or Isaac or Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, or Joseph. An unexpected surprise may come, however, when looking closely at them. You begin to see your own reflection. A great irony in my life is that despite my Southern Baptist upbringing, my own journey of the Spirit had its genesis in my hometown's Roman Catholic church, where in the fall of 1958, during a nuptial mass, I had what might be called an ecstatic experience, a split second in which my imagination went off the rails, or something actually happened. Whatever it was, it left me confused, frightened, fascinated, and curious to know what it meant. I still don't have a clue, and therein lies the greatest irony of my life, because what I've done with my life, the paths I've gone down, the man I've become, can be traced to that single moment more than 50 years ago. It happened again, or seemed to, in the spring of 1968, my senior year in university, this time in an Episcopal church, during the nuptial mass for my college roommate. Then, 2 weeks later, a car crash left me with 2 fractured vertebrae, a broken jaw, pulverized gums, and broken teeth. 10 days in the hospital were followed by more than 2 months in a rented hospital bed in the den of my parents' home. I had little else to do but watch the limited fare of daytime television, read, and think. With graduation impending and the military draft a certainty, my life plan in the near term had been boot camp, advanced infantry training, and Vietnam. If anything followed that, it would be graduate school or joining my dad in the family business or something else. But that was then, before the accident. Now, given that it would be at least 6 months before I could even rise to a sitting position without first strapping on a metal back brace, and that I faced more reconstructive oral surgery, my fitness for military service was in serious doubt. With room to consider the future, and still reeling from that second experience, I convinced myself that my future was in the church. Within a year and a half, I joined the Episcopal Church, married my college sweetheart, moved to Virginia, and had begun my first term at the Episcopal Seminary in Alexandria, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. The idyllic existence of a graduate student had little in common with the lives of the clergymen with whom he worked on weekends, the life for which we were preparing ourselves. Toward the end of my second academic year, with just 1 more to go before graduation, ordination, and a life I was not at all sure I wanted, I requested and received permission to leave academics for a full-time internship in a local parish, St. Mark's, on Capitol Hill in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. While I assumed the year would be important, I didn't suspect that my assumptions about almost everything were about to be blown sky-high during what would prove to be, at that point, the ride of my life. By the mid-1950s, the phenomenon known as white flight had eroded St. Mark's membership to the point that the diocesan authorities considered closing its doors. Then, with new leadership calling on interested pagans, bored Christians, and others, and offering lectures and discussions on topics such as Christianity and the intellectual and Christianity and the bored citizen, the parish began a remarkable evolution, in time gaining a national reputation for its innovative uses of the arts and liturgy, for its revolutionary approach to Christian education, for its policy of whatever you believe, whatever you do not believe, you are welcome at this table, and for the commitment, caliber, and enviable talent of its laity. All were welcome to attend services and classes, but membership in the parish was another matter. The first requirement was participation in the St. Mark's confirmation class, including Episcopalians previously confirmed, a 16-week course that included 2 mandatory weekend retreats. The next step was to assume one's share of responsibility for the overall well-being of the parish. This included a financial commitment, but also a pledge of at least 20 hours of service each month, these spent in groundskeeping, choir, altar guild, teaching, children or adults, or one of the various committees or special projects. While the rectors of St. Mark's were strong leaders, the organizing principle of the community didn't allow the sort of overwhelming personality found at the center of most successful churches. Instead, that center was to be found in the community itself, and in the biblical principle of accountability, learning to live by the power of one's word, that is, learning to be faithful, without which servanthood is impossible. I learned that one of the undergirdings of faithfulness is vulnerability, stretching oneself with support toward living the sort of unhidden humanness that Jesus had lived. This called for a reading of Scripture that I'd never before imagined, to read it not as admonishments about right and wrong, good and bad, but as a vast reflective surface in which to see our own lives, individually and collectively. Making that switch, shifting my perspective on stories and characters I'd known since before I could read, regarding it all as metaphor, proved to be its own task. Among my duties that year would be to deliver the Sunday morning sermon, not once, but several times, and to what I considered the most intimidating gathering of human beings I'd ever faced. The congregation at St. Mark's neither expected nor wanted pat answers and theological dazzlements from the preacher, but rather his insight into the human issue at the heart of the scriptural passages for the day, and plain talk, human being to human beings, about how that issue had presented itself in his life, and how it had been resolved, or how it continued to have ramifications. In fact, talking about some issue that remained unresolved could be far more useful because it was human, after all, to have ongoing struggles, such as character issues, self-doubts, damaged relationships with family and friends. My mentor that year, the rector of St. Mark's, said that if I was honest in telling them about my own struggles, the congregation would love me for it. If I tried to impress them with my education or manipulate them with sentimentality, it was a near certainty that someone from the congregation would stand and ask me to stop and sit down. If they didn't, he said, he would. Over the coming weeks, I observed that he used a biblical story almost as a morality play, the characters as archetypally human, dramatic elements in the narrative. Without its seeming forced, contrived, sappy, or inappropriately revealing, he would use one or more of the characters as a device for reflecting on some personal experience or some element in his own character. Afterward, whether it was immediate, hours later, or the next day, I might find that something in me had stirred, as if he'd been speaking about me or on my behalf. Once, for instance, after he'd talked about his own struggles with authority, the scriptural passage may have been from David's conflict with Absalom, his son, I had a better sense of my part in the ongoing conflicts with my bishop and my father. Following the service, people talked about the sermon, how they'd seen themselves reflected in the characters in the story. These responses were possible, and here was the key to the method, because the stories are our stories, and the people in them are all of us. That reflective use of Scripture and teaching is the only model that makes sense to me. Because it does not require a religious point of view, it makes the Bible available to everyone. Graduating in 1973, I served parishes in Texas and California. In 1981, I joined a startup training organization, the Life Training, now More to Life, which by 1990 had opened training centers in the United States, London and Cambridge, England, and Johannesburg and Durban, South Africa. We taught people to change the negative stories they told about themselves that led to repeated failures. It was a psychological, but also a spiritual process, the beginning of an exodus from bondage of spirit to freedom, a personal journey to be taken in the company of others on the same path. By the time I left the organization in 1995, I had led or co-led more than 300 two-day trainings, plus evening workshops and lectures, logging more than 10,000 contact hours with groups as diverse as Wyoming cowboys, British nobility, federal prison inmates, white and black South Africans involved in the anti-apartheid struggles, plumbers, housewives, MDs, house husbands, electricians, psychologists, psychiatrists, mechanics, CEOs, and high court judges. I also went into management training and consulting in corporate culture, as well coaching and crisis intervention. After 8 years in the church, having served a wealthy parish, a fabulously wealthy parish, and a blue-collar parish, I can say that the human issues in each bore a striking similarity. Yet there, and in the groups I've worked with as a trainer, the powerful, the powerless, and those in between virtually always expressed surprise at discovering that they stood on the same human ground. Few of the stories I heard in the course of those 20-plus years, and none of the stories I lived, would fail to find their parallel among the myriad human tales in the Bible. I slipped it in that you, too, live inside the metaphor. I invite you to consider that possibility, to ponder whether these ancient stories resonate with your own. As you will see from my own musings, you need not be religious for this. In fact, if you're alive and breathing and reading this, these stories and their characters have already shaped you, and in greater measure than you might think, as they have shaped us all, religious and non-religious alike. Their moral, ethical, and spiritual DNA are embedded in the foundations of our civilization, in our awareness of who we are as people and as individuals, our best and worst selves. Because I'll be referring to it from time to time, a brief overview of what biblical scholars call the source theory of the Bible is in order. The first 5 books of the Bible, known to Jews as Torah, to Christians as the Pentateuch, are composed of an interweaving of 4 primary strands of source material, known to biblical scholars as J, Jahwist or Yahwist, E, Elohist, D, Deuteronomist, and P, priestly, each of separate authorship, at times telling different versions of the same story. For example, one creation story is told by P in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 3, another by J in Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 4 verse 24, and, except for J and E, written in different historical periods. Their work was put into its final form by R, redactors, editors of such genius that some modern scholars regard their work to be a 5th source. Finally, since this book follows the book of Genesis, I suggest that you also read the biblical text itself, and that you use a modern translation. While I have relied on the translations of Robert Alter, Richard Elliott Friedman, Everett Fox, and others, unless otherwise noted, all biblical quotations are from the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, 1999. Part 1. The Beginning. Act 1. Adam and Eve, but mostly Eve. 1. As line leader, you make a rather startling entry. Imagine yourself as the first human being. You've popped into the world inside the body of a full-grown adult. You've gone from non-being to being and become fully conscious, although you have no memories, no parents, no siblings, friends, or enemies. No clothes and no language. Though it seems reasonable that from thy bowels, as our Elizabethan ancestors were wont to say, would arise some expression of, "What the?" as you stood, sat, or lay blank-brained and absorbing those first bursts of 5-fold sensory input. This wordless sense of being and identity is just the sort of abstraction that your big Homo sapiens brain is designed to ponder and dissect. Advanced queries such as, "Who am I?" and "What am I?" will follow in time. But all those thoughts require context, and at present you don't have any. So your brain, with its capacity for objectification, starts building some. Perhaps you begin by noticing that you and a tree, say, are not the same thing. You have feet, for instance, and trees don't. You can move from here to there. They can't. Then, suddenly, all about you, as if appearing from nowhere, which they did, are hopping things, jumping things, soaring, crawling, running, buzzing, growling, chirping things. Your second, "What the?" Your first adrenaline buzz, and an inner voice screams, "Run!" Then a louder inner voice shouts, "No! Wait! Look!" So you do, and you see that those tiny creatures hovering around the flowers, and that big, stripy one with the huge teeth, and the ones in the trees, all have feet. They can move from here to there. As for the how and the why of them, well, the same all-powerful being who made you lets you know that he also made them, just so you wouldn't be alone, and how nice was that? Now, as you go about naming everything, bird, bee, tiger, horse, platypus, you notice that there are at least 2 of each of them, but only 1 of you. The facility takes care of your basic physical needs, food, water, shelter, climate control, so there's little for you to do but eat, sleep, hang out with the birds, bugs, plants, and animals, ponder it all, and build those contexts. No hassles, no worries. Except for that one tiny wrinkle that came up during the tour when the all-powerful being pointed to one tree and said, "Don't eat the fruit of that one." He was pretty emphatic, going on about good, bad, and die. Your software being quite adept at sniffing out danger, even in the subtleties of mood and tone, from the sudden shift in voice inflection, and the look, and the finger pointing, and the finger wagging, you'd picked up on the bit about don't eat. But die? What's that? If, however, he'd meant that you were not even to think about it, well, too bad, because that tree you might never have noticed is now the most interesting thing in the garden. 2. Another creature, one like you, sort of, shows up. That is, until one day when, on waking for a nap, you find a new creature in the garden. It makes you feel all funny. You forget about the tree. Then, sometime later, when the 2 of you come up for air, you remember to mention it. So now your partner is curious too, and when you 2 aren't, involved, you both can be found at the tree, your curiosity now infatuation, now compulsion, moving you closer each day until finally there you are, the 2 of you, beneath it, contemplating the heavy, hanging fruit of it, dangerously, flirtatiously close to the forbidden touch. Day after day it hovers there, silent, juicy, whispering. Yum. 3. It's entirely possible that none of this is what you've assumed it to be. The previous 2 sections have bits and pieces of both creation stories. Yes, both. The Bible's opening line, the familiar, "In the beginning," is the creation of P, as is the story of the man and the woman who just popped into being. The tree is from the second creation story, J's version, which recounts that the woman was created after the man. Yes, Genesis can get a little confusing. There's more. For instance, you probably grew up with the idea that in Genesis the first man was named Adam. Nope. While P writes that God created man in his image, male and female he created them, he never mentions anyone actually named Adam, or Eve, for that matter, or a Garden of Eden. In fact, we're well into J's story, which begins at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4b, before the man is referred to as the man, which makes sense from a linguistic point of view, given that Adam is the Hebrew word for human. Yes, human, male and female, So Adam is a common gender noun rather than a proper name, a hey you, and Eve is as much an Adam as Adam. While Eve is given her name by the man, Eve means mother of all that lives, which is interesting since she has not yet given birth, and though J does refer to him as Adam, at least in translation, the first man is never officially named. I suppose that were one to send a formal announcement or invitation, say, the proper inscription would read, Eve and friend. The text that is actually there in Genesis and what readers assume is there are often quite different. Indeed, among its other functions, Genesis challenges assumptions, a role made necessary by thousands of years of attempts at interpreting its contents, itself a role to which any interpreter, being human, will bring a point of view. Moreover, people tend to defend their assumptions regarding Genesis, or for that matter any part of the Bible, with the tenacity of a lioness guarding her cubs. While proponents of this or that assumption, however outrageous, might truly believe theirs to be the product of divine inspiration, some, for their own reasons, likely made it up. Or someone else did, and they believed it. Take Eve, for example. 4. About the woman. In the JPS translation, P's account of the creation of the humans reads, God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The URJ translation of the same Hebrew text reads, God now said, Let us create human beings in our image, after our likeness. So God created the human beings in the divine image, creating them in the image of God, creating them male and female. Note that the latter translates the Hebrew Adam as human beings, not man, as in the JPS and most English translations. Note also the use of the plural human beings. About that, Bible scholar Tamara Cohn Eskenazi writes, This translation resorts to the plural to avoid using misleading masculine pronouns later in the verse. Literally, the Hebrew has, and God created the Adam. In the image of God he created him, it. Male and female he created them, shifting the object pronoun from singular to plural. By referring to Adam, the text is not describing an individual, but a new class of beings that comprises female and male from the start, both of them in God's image. The shift from singular to plural does not convey that man was created before woman. Rather, it seems to say that our humanity as Adam precedes our division into sexual categories. Our humanity comes first, our sexual identity next. J's account of the creation of the humans is earthy, intimate, and hands-on. In chapter 2, verse 7, Yahweh fashions the man from the soil, earth, Adama, then breathes into him the breath of life, which, breath and spirit being the same word in Hebrew, nephesh, is an act of infusing the human being with life and the divine spirit, a significant act. Then, to provide the man with companions, Yahweh fashions, again from the soil, the birds and animals. Still, since the man has no proper mate, at verse 21, Yahweh puts him to sleep, takes one of the man's ribs, and creates one. But one what, exactly? In Hebrew, the phrase is ezer kenegdo, which for centuries has been translated into English as helper or helpmate, and taken to mean something akin to the little woman. The Hebrew, writes Robert Alter in his commentary on Genesis, is notoriously difficult to translate. The second term means alongside, opposite him, a counterpart to him. Help is too weak because it suggests a merely auxiliary function, whereas ezer elsewhere connotes active intervention on behalf of someone, especially in military contexts, as often in the Psalms. Alter translates the phrase as sustainer beside him, the man. Richard Elliott Friedman as a strength corresponding to him. In other words, the woman was created in order to provide the man with a partner, an equal partner. This leaves us with nothing in either.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?